This is On Diversity, a podcast series by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. This is the second season, and I'm your host, Liang Kai Sing, Associate Director of IPS and also a former journalist. Today's episode is on the new civil society and social media activism, and we have Qiyun, creator of The Weird and Wild, an Instagram page filled with colourful hand-drawn graphics on a variety of environment-related topics. Hi, Qiyun.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, and then we also have Dr. Carol Soon, IPS Head of Society and Culture. She has been studying the effects of new media and activism. Hi, Carol.
Hi, so good to be here.
Welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you.
So I'll go straight to the questions. I would just like to know more about Qiyun, what got you started with climate activism on Instagram?
My name is Qiyun. I started The Weird and Wild back in 2018 when I was still a third-year undergraduate at NUS studying environmental studies. And I created it without really the intention of doing advocacy work. I mean, that's very broad, but I wanted to, I realized that actually at that time, sustainability was gaining ground, but trying to find information that is location-specific, that's very unique to Singapore was actually a lot more difficult than I expected. And I realized that if you don't make the information accessible to the layperson who wants to get into sustainability, then you're going to hinder a lot of action. And very specifically at that point was my friends were looking to recycle certain things because we lived on campus, and they said it's impossible to Google like recycling Singapore and you get all sorts of things except the resource that you really needed. And I found out that it was tucked under like some random corner of NEA's website that you really have to dig for. So I started to create infographics to tell people like, I know where to find all these things. You just come to me and I will provide it for you because I'm already very active. And it sort of has evolved since then because, in terms of like providing informational awareness, you inevitably go into advocacy because you learn so many things that you just wish more people know about. So yeah, then it is what it is today.
Okay, let me just go to Carol first. We heard from Qiyun now that how she started with climate activism. So why are we seeing more of such social activism, and is social media a good platform for this?
When we talk about activism, it is so common right now to associate it with social media because social media is such a large part of our life. It's so prevalent and so pervasive. But I think we all need to take a step back and think back just how decades ago, or maybe even centuries ago, right? Human beings, the minute they could start communicating with one another or start organizing themselves, they have embarked on collective action at different scales and on a wide array of causes. So if we just look at the Singapore history, for instance, we saw examples of massive collective action that led to policy change. So for instance, in the 1950s, Shireen Foza and her allies, who did a huge amount of work which culminated, right, in the Women's Charter. So what did they do then? Those were days, obviously, without social media, but they mobilized supporters, right? They walked the ground. They could, craft messages that resonate not just with their local constituents, but also international constituents. But you look at today, social media certainly has, I think, given a leg up to collective action and activism. I think one of the key ways in which it does so is that it really encourages and allows for creativity and many what I would call micro acts of challenging, right? Challenging those in power, challenging institutions, etc. So users of social media could use a wide array of so-called micro tactics like humor, sarcasm, memes, wordplay, or even aesthetics, right? Essentially, it helps them to so-called circumvent state surveillance and repercussions. And this is not unique to Singapore. It's evident in other parts of Asia, such as the youth in Cambodia when they were protesting, as well as users in Europe and even North America. So I think that's one key thing. The other key thing to note about the connection between social media and activism is really the target audience, right? Let's think about who are using social media. Essentially, it's the young people. Predominantly young people, more young people than older people are using social media, especially TikTok, Instagram, etc. So it's also a reflection of what we see is a shifting model of citizenship. So, in the US, you have the older generations who are called the dutiful citizens. They tend to join civil society organizations and groups that are more hierarchical, whereas the newer generation, the younger generation, are what are called self-actualizing citizens, right? They favor loose networks of action.
Okay, interesting. But Qiyun, I just wanted to ask, at which point do you feel that you became really popular, and what do you think helped in your popularity actually?
That's a tough question.
I mean, I know I saw your account before. It's really colorful and nice. Your drawings are really nice.
I would say that the popularity wasn't something that was overnight. It's continued. I mean, I make sure that whatever that I'm doing, it's really almost a reflection of my own growth as an environmentalist in Singapore. And I think as I journeyed through that, more people came along at very different points in time. But I can say, I think quite conclusively that there are certain points where popularity, of course, I became more popular because of certain topical issues. So I would say that the first instance was when me and my friend Pamela from Thinkats SG, where we held a digital climate strike. I think this was in 2019, where Greta Thunberg got very popular and was hosting youth Fridays for Future activism. And we thought that wasn't very possible in Singapore because the political appetite just wasn't there. And also because we had no time, frankly. Yeah, but I think from there, we got a little bit of popularity. And the second one, the one that I can remember most is, I guess, then again at Singapore Climate Rally, where I was just, doing a lot more awareness raising online. And then I participated physically at the rally. And then again, I think the following year, that was 2020 already, during the Dover Forest conversations, that spiked again. And I think, those were the biggest spikes. But other points in time was, of course, when I post more topical things like Chinese New Year, Christmas, those things like lifestyle get a bit of traction. Because
what kind of Chinese New Year lifestyle contents that?
So sometimes I'll post things like, during Chinese New Year, people wear new clothes, right? How do you rethink certain modes of consumption? And also Christmas, how do you rethink certain ideals of gifting? And I would say that at those points, I got popular not because the content was political or it's more topical, but at the same time very actionable.
Relatable also?
Yeah, it's also relatable. So I guess there are two types of content that tend to do well on my page, and then it just grew from there.
Maybe I could just add on to what Qiyun said. And, before I forget, I actually should have said this earlier. It's a great pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
I follow you on Instagram.
Oh, you have a fan here.
Yes, I followed your work when I was a student at USP. I wanted to take your module.
Oh, mutual fan.
But you know what you just said really also explains the popularity and the important role of social media in collective action and activism. Right? It is the strong sense of intimacy and personalization. So you talked about how you started, right? It wasn't with, I think, a grand vision to enact change, but really to express yourself, right? Yeah. And in your own small way, wanting to make some level of change, right? And that's intrinsically tied to your personal beliefs, your personal values, and even your personal lifestyle. So I think this is what we see when social media users go online, whether they are creating content or engaging with the content through sharing. It's a lot of it is really tied to whom they are, right? Which also then is reflected in the type of so-called causes or issues that we see are gaining traction on social media today. What we call issues that are very intrinsically linked, right, to people's lived realities.
Yeah.
Okay, but Qiyun, what have you observed on social media? Other than you, do you meet more friends on social media who are also fellow activists, and not just on climate change, but also other topics also?
Yeah, I think at least for me, most of the connections that I've made in civil society happened in the last two and a half years. So that meant that, at certain points, I met people who were advocating for like migrant workers, sex workers, even those fighting for like women's rights and things like that. So even inequality. And I think, by the nature of the work that we were doing in that, we were fighting for very similar values, very similar beliefs, just in different topics. And sometimes we also found synergy. I don't know whether this is in the mainstream consciousness yet, but climate justice or intersectional activism became a very big thing, at least for me in the past 2 years as I got more and more involved in climate advocacy. And I think because of that, it's almost inevitable that you will meet other people because you realize how much, like, for example, climate change intersects with inequality, intersects with racism, and you naturally want to learn more and meet people who are fighting on those fronts.
Do you have collaborations?
Yeah, actually quite often.
What kind of collaborations?
I'm not sure whether you call this a collaboration, but I think, let's say, on COP26, which happened recently. Yes, there were a bunch of us who released a youth statement on Youth Day of COP26, so 5th November. And this was actually a collective of 19 of us co-authors from various different groups, but all climate related at the start. So that means we were from faith-based environmental organizations, nature groups, climate, sustainability, energy groups. And we wrote a statement essentially reiterating and amplifying our ask on what we want our leaders or corporations to take action on. And I think what surprised me was that actually those who signed, because we opened it for signatories in the 2 days after writing it, a lot of people signed on, and these were people that I didn't expect to be allies. So we had LGBTQ groups, we had like Ruma Foundation, Rainbow Girls Singapore, Katong Queers, and then like boating organizations signed up, vegan food stores, blue groups. And that to me sort of made me wonder like what sparked that interest from groups that are not even related to climate change. And they must have resonated with something inside. And I think that to me made me realize how much climate change will affect so many different groups. And this is perhaps not a collaboration, but signals there is so much potential as to what we can work together on because we agree on some basic fundamentals.
I think what Qiyun just said really does demonstrate what in public policy we call wicked problems, right? I think increasingly the kind of policy issues that we face, whether it's aging, climate change, population growth, racial discrimination, they no longer reside in the silos of a particular domain. They no longer can be solved by one specific ministry or government agency, because oftentimes the kind of factors that contribute to the phenomenon is really multiplex, right? So I think...
Carol, what is wicked problem actually?
Okay. I mean, it's classic public policy talk, right? Wicked problems in public policy study essentially refer to problems that plague society and countries, but there usually are there is very little consensus on what causes the problem. And oftentimes there's also very little consensus in terms of what the solution to be.
So it's not just evil.
No, and there's not just one so-called cause of evil or one source of evil, to use your word. And there are also many intervention points to solve that problem, right? So really then that's why I think what the example that Qiyun just gave illustrates how climate change is a wicked problem, which then draws the attention and the interest of different stakeholders whom we think come from actually, quite independent domains. I think just recently it was SG Climate Rally, which released a joint statement together with whom? Together with TWC2, right? And Made for More. And what was the joint statement about? It was on improving migrant workers' well-being. So you don't really kind of attach that to SG Climate Change. You also didn't quite expect SG Climate Change to collaborate or work with, say, TWC2, right? So I think increasingly, while it is interesting as an academic exercise and perhaps as a practitioner to look at the differences between what we call traditional civil society actors and new actors such as social media content creators such as yourself, it is useful to look at the differences, if there are differences in terms of, say, mobilization strategies, partnership formation, etc. But increasingly, we see alliances, overlaps, or even crossovers, right? And and this is not new. So I think it was quite a couple of years back when we were talking about saving Bukit Brown. And at that time, you saw traditional civil society organizations like Singapore Heritage Society and Nature Society working with, SOS Bukit Brown and All Things Bukit Brown, which essentially started online. So I think this is really interesting, right? We will see a lot of overlaps between different types of organizations and also overlaps in terms of issues.
And I also wonder whether it's because social media makes certain organizations more visible, because if it wasn't for the work that all these people were doing online, I would not have found out about Meet for More, for example, or TWC or Home. And I think once, because you see traditional forms of, let's say, mobilization where people gather at Hong Lim Park or you hear from word of mouth that this is happening here, and fighting for Bukit Brown, for example, or even like Sungai Thief Market, there was actually a small movement trying to save that. Without realizing that these people exist, you kind of cannot tie yourself to those organizations or find synergies. And I thought that social media, because of certain algorithms and because of the networks that you're in, inevitably you will find another organization that you're like, hey, I want to check you out, that I cannot walk down to your office the next day and be like, okay, who are all these civil society organizations? Because so much of this is also sort of underground in a way that it doesn't show up physically. These are not organizations with offices, with logos. So I thought social media kind of accelerated those kinds of alliances because it makes these voices more visible.
I have a bit naughty question for you, actually.
Okay.
Naughty is good.
I mean, because you mentioned about just now you mentioned you don't have time for this, or you don't go down to Hong Lim Park and all that. So, naturally my a bit slightly judgy question is that you guys just keyboard warriors?
Yeah, that comes up a lot because they will say things like, there's a term called slacktivism where you're just talking online. I would say that actually before COVID happened at least, environmental groups meet up very often. We have a lot of events where we will, there are festivals, there are parades or yearly events where we will meet up and build community. We have cleanups that happen regularly. And at those points, I would say that these are convening points for us to build relationships, especially for newcomers and those that are slightly older in the scene. But as a result of COVID, sort of all these things have to happen online now. And of course, keyboard warriorism happens very naturally because where else can we gather in a group of, let's say our statement gathered 300 signatures. How can you get 300 signatures if not at Hong Lim Park physically, right? So I think that online spaces have emerged as that kind of because of COVID. But I would think that, these kinds of things, we need to recognize these are mobilizations. They are not, it's very different from organizations where you're building, fixed communities with a certain structure and you actually continuously fight for things. Mobilization is really, you're really using all kinds of marketing channels to get people to speak up about a certain thing, but it's very, very short-lived. And anything on social media by default is performative. You are performing to an online audience. You are, of course, on your keyboard fighting for a certain issue, but it's because of the nature of it rather than the kind of, beliefs or stereotypes behind the idea of keyboard warrior. It's really a matter of circumstance.
I think, Kai Sing, you brought up an important question. You raised an important issue pertaining to really, the bottom line is the impact of online expression and participation, right? And you brought up the term slacktivism. And I think this is a perennial concern or question that plague, civic engagement. I know this sounds like a really long time ago, but I think it was in 2002 or 2003 when I was doing my master thesis looking at online political communities. The literature leading up to that time, right, a lot of it came from the West. And even then there were thoughts about, really what is the impact of online communities that bring people of the same ideology or values together, that have, say, a common purpose or agenda, right? So there are, of course, many plus points to civic engagement in the online space. There are essentially very, very low, if not no barriers to entry, right? You don't even need to, sign up to be a member, right?
No, but if your content is bad, nobody
yes, of course.
uses it.
Yes, but the low barriers to entry also means there's very low barriers to exit. So I think a challenge oftentimes is how do you retain and sustain people's interest and commitment. But that said, I think whether you call it selectivism or keyboard warriorism, I always feel that any kind of participation is better than nil participation, right? Because it is an exercise or a practice for each of us, right, to participate in society, in social life, in political life, and we never know where that will bring us. I mean, you talk about your very humble beginnings, your content creation starting from when you were a third year undergrad student, and look at where you are now, right? So I think we should not underestimate even the smallest acts of expression on social media.
Yeah, and I guess I always take the slight hesitation with the word keyboard warrior or what they call
don't get angry, then get angry.
Yeah, no, not angry, but social justice warriors, right? Because they come with certain perceptions of what do these very loaded terms necessarily mean. And I really like what Carol said about how these are really just forms of expressions, but they have been used to weaponize certain kinds of action. Let's say cancel culture is a very big one, right? But what does cancel culture really mean? It's a mix of defamation, slander, at the same time accountability and justice. And it can be used as a double-edged sword. So things like keyboard warrior is also the very same thing when, if taken offline, it's known as civic participation or, like citizen juries or that kind of like similar modes but in a different way. So I always say that these terms are loaded because it comes with certain connotations and certain people tend to use it more than others.
Interesting you pointed out cancel culture. I mean, there's also the cancel culture, right? Like people who are against cancel culture. And I think the ones who are trying to advocate, like let's say this particular person did something wrong and then they try to boycott their content, boycott their whatever. Do you think they actually take pride in the cancel culture itself, or they think that, no, you don't call us cancel culture, we're just doing something right?
I think what Qiyun earlier said resonated with me, right? I mean, at the end of the day, an act itself, it could be, it could have positive impact, it could have negative impact. I think we should avoid labels. But that said, one of the things that we have seen, especially in the past 2 years, people being more bold and less hesitant in stepping out and calling out what they deem as unjust or wrongful behavior, right? Then, unfortunately, it then spilled over. I think it's good to have a debate and a discussion on the issue, the action, its consequences for community, its consequences for society and country. But I think it's a bit problematic when people go beyond that and start, attacking individuals or worse, performing what we call online CSI, right? Digging up.
That's doxing, right?
Yes, that's doxing. That's harassment. That's cyberbullying. And an unintended consequence of that could be the migration of self-expression to, say, closed groups. So we recently completed a study in IPS, on how youth use social media to raise awareness and to advocate for change, for different types of issues, right? We conducted a few focus groups. We did a focus group with content producers. We also did focus groups with different types of youth, social media users. And what came out was that there seems to be this fear, or hesitant in expressing oneself on social media, stemming not so much of fear from, say, government persecution, but fear from being censored, being criticized, being called out by fellow peers, fellow social media users. So what do these people tell us? They then tell us, okay, if they have an opinion to voice about a quote-unquote sensitive issue, whether it's a social issue or a political issue, they usually won't post on social media, right? They will actually communicate and share with their friends on instant messaging sites such as Telegram and WhatsApp. So what this means is there could be a migration of part of the public discourse into the closed space, which could be disadvantageous, right? Because we all know if we want to raise awareness for something, or if we want to gauge public sentiments, we need them to be accessible. We need them to be known.
Are these people content creators, or are they just
users? We're talking about users, especially say youths in the late 20s, early 30s who are already working, and they are quite sensitive to the possible repercussions their posts may have on, say, their professional lives, right? So I think there is a danger of invisible discourse. So that's something we might want to think about as an unintended consequence of, say, cancer culture at its worst.
Yeah.
So from what you say, they are users. So is it like migration from like, instead of in the past, they will like comment on your posts or comment on like Facebook, Instagram, all that, or even like post status updates themselves. They decided not to do it on social media, decided not to be so public, and they just do it on Telegram and WhatsApp. Do you mean that?
Yes. So this is what we got. I mean, how representative it is, I think it's worth investigating, but it does surface a trend, right? Where people, because they are concerned with the consequences of their posts, if they are shared publicly on social media, then go so-called offline from open social media platforms to closed social media platforms, such as your instant messaging apps, to have that discussion, right? So their sentiments, their opinions, and what they think should be done about those issues are then not accessible to policymakers or to activists or change makers like yourself.
Qiyun, do you see that in your friends, or like do people tend to slide into your DMs instead of like posting comments?
Yeah, there have been instances where, I really do see that, and where either, let's say, it could be during the general elections where certain people might have views about, climate change policies of various manifestos, or even day-to-day things, sensitive issues like Dover Forest, or even like, I don't know, very related to climate change for me. And people would say, can you keep me anonymous, but I want to share this with you? Or people would say, can you post this on my behalf? Because I'm a bit more public about certain views, especially on climate change. And I do see that, and sometimes I wonder what is really stopping people from certain public expressions. Like you said, it could be fear of repercussions in terms of professional development, because the opportunities for virality and for things to be misinterpreted is very high now with social media, and with tools like screenshotting something, posting it on Reddit or Hardware Zone, and it goes viral. The tendencies for malice or these kinds of things tend to make people more afraid of, okay, then I don't want to anyhow say it, just in case it ends up somewhere, or like on Mothership, and I didn't intend it to end up there. And I thought that was a bit sad, because it shows, I guess, some level of irresponsible usage of a platform like the media, which allows for some of these things to happen. But otherwise, to me, people like who have to be public about certain things, you sort of have to be open to also a lot of criticism. And for me to do this publicly, I stumbled into it, right? But it also means building up a lot of courage to dare to say things that say, based on my lived experiences, I'm advocating for certain things because I believe it's right. and it's backed up by certain science. And if I get criticized, then it's about how do you manage that online now? Because it can mean something like saying sorry or being more willing to publicly say, actually, I was wrong about this and I changed my mind. It's almost as though social media doesn't give you that chance to change your mind about certain things because I put it out there 5 years ago means I must still believe it today, right?
Oh yeah, because there are people who get criticized for like very
For past
old
things,
posts. Yeah.
So to me, it becomes like as someone who grew up in the digital age, how do I then manage the public expression? Because I don't think we've been taught to deal with criticism very well. And it's something that now with more and more people online, you need to learn to deal with criticism because people can also hide behind, I think social media becomes a shield because it's not your personal identity. It can be crafted, right? Like, I mean, even my social media is crafted to some extent.
Curated.
It's curated, yeah. So I would say that, having to build up that skin to learn what is public discourse, to learn what is discussion, debate, in a way that doesn't turn ugly is, I think, a digital tool that we will need.
Yeah, so it kind of like harkens back to the point I made earlier about exercise, right? We all need that opportunity to practice, to exercise our muscle for civic engagement. And it's a journey that could be fraught with, hard knocks.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, but Carol, so just now we were mentioning about like there's a lot more these small social media accounts and all that. I think it seems to be quite different from in the past. The civil societies, they tend to be bigger and more organized. What do you think about this? And do you think social media activism actually translates into like constructive policy actions?
So when we talk about activism and its impact, I think, again, a common association is activism equals change in policy equals change in law or regulation, right? But if you look at the history of activism everywhere, okay, and the literature on collective action and social movements, there are other outcomes, right? So, for example, changing people's raising awareness, educating people, or influencing people's attitudes towards a particular community or group, and then pushing for change in policy or regulation. So just take an instance, right, to illustrate this range of agenda and objectives. Look at LGBTQ rights, right? You will have certain individuals or groups who are content with increasing the public awareness of the kind of discrimination that LGBTQ individuals feel, and that's fine. And they're content with just doing that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And then you have within the community others who have the ambition or the vision to bring about legislation change, for instance, right, repeal 377A. So I would say activists are definitely not a homogeneous group, right? Translating into policy action, yes, certainly we have seen instances of that, right, elsewhere, and also in Singapore. So I think clearly one of the more recent ones is because of the spotlight cast on sexual crimes and physical violence. It is leading to the government to review the penalty framework, right, to include harsher punishment for perpetrators. So this is just one of the several instances.
This came about from Monica Bay's Instagram account, right?
And
actually.
also, yeah, that I think that was one of the start,
yeah.
But I think it was also catalyzed by an incident, I think, relating to a dentistry student.
Right.
So certainly, I think that also reflects the increased responsiveness on the part of policymakers, right, to discourse on social media. So 2 points. We need to have a broader understanding and of the impact of activism, that it doesn't necessarily only make an impact if we see legislative change, because attitudes, right, require a lot of time to shift, and you need people to do the work to highlight certain issues, especially, say, the lived realities of marginalized or fringe groups whom would basically fall by the wayside.
Yeah, and I think when I break down your question, right, so the first thing that popped up to me was constructive policy action. And I thought that word was slightly loaded because what does constructive change look like? And does that mean that, if my activism doesn't fall within a certain category of ideas, of beliefs or social norms, does that become disruptive or not constructive? So I think that is something that I grapple with a lot, because I think in environmental activism, either in Singapore or elsewhere, right, something that we always want to see is essentially not status quo. We want to reimagine new worlds that are more equal, more just, more green. And perhaps that's just not what the mainstream or, mainstream policymakers, corporate leaders necessarily want. And when that happens, does my activism then suddenly get branded as, you're not constructive, you're not engaging constructively? So things like in the UK, right, there's Extinction Rebellion. They're often seen as very disruptive civil disobedience groups. And they say that, some people have criticized them to be, okay, I know this kind of thing's not useful. Why don't you talk to your governments? But sometimes those methods don't work. And then who gets to be engaged and who doesn't is a whole other conversation. But I really agree with what Carol said about how it's not just, such actions doesn't necessarily lead to government policy. And that's maybe not the intent, even if that's the target. So like things like Extinction Rebellion, right, what they want is mass mobilizations and awareness of or waking up to a climate crisis. So as much as their messaging is to governments, perhaps what they're changing really is people's minds on, firstly, civil disobedience, secondly, what is the climate crisis? And I say this because even in Singapore, something like, there's a podcast called Something Private, and something that I think they did really well is really destigmatizing a lot of taboos, especially around things like women issues, even like female sexual health. And because of these things, they didn't necessarily change like, a government policy about female sexual health or, even things like contraception. But a lot more people I've seen are reposting some of their stuff because perhaps they don't want to say it, but hey, somebody else posted it and I agree with it. I'm going to post it online. And you socialize the idea of, okay, it's okay to be talking about like female orgasms or all sorts of things, right? And I thought like that is a very good change that still comes out of social media activism that otherwise would not have made it into the mainstream.
Yes, I mean, essentially it's a way of saying to women, hey, you take charge of your own bodies, right?
Yeah.
You're in control. Maybe just to extend a little bit, and this is linked to your question, Kai-Sing, about policy action. I think what we have also seen in the past couple of years is not just a broadening of issues and broadening of strategies, but also a broadening of the targets at which such mobilization is aimed at, right? Because when we think about policy action, inadvertently, we think about government.
Definitely.
We think about politicians,
especially in Singapore,
members of parliament. But if we've seen, especially for the incidents that took place in the last 2 years, who are the other targets? Okay, it's no longer just challenging the government or challenging certain government policies, but also corporations, right, like ExxonMobil, institutions like universities, businesses like retailers, gym operators, right? So we should not forget this as well, and not just be too focused and parochial at just looking at a specific definition of activism and a specific definition of its outcome.
Yeah, and I also wonder sometimes if it's also the medium or at least the political context that you're in, right? In, let's say, a place where media can be highly regulated and what gets put out is often not a result of what the public wants, and it's curated by certain individuals who might want to stay out of certain OB lines. Things like more marginalized voices or issues may not get spotlighted on mainstream media because it might not be palatable or it just might not be what the editors necessarily want. And social media has emerged as this alternative platform for democratizing information, democratizing what goes viral and what reaches the mass. And I think that it really occurs possibly because of certain issues that get stymied when they go up to the press. And I thought that could be a reason why this kind of activism works, because if I write about a certain issue and I want to send it to an editor, before it even gets published, it's probably rejected and I wouldn't even know
Thrown
about
into
it.
the waste bin.
Yeah, so that's why I think activism in this form can also occur to enact change, because how is it going to appear on an opinion page somewhere? Yeah.
I think this also speaks to, I wouldn't say I would hate to generalize, but there is a palpable sense of, say, disenfranchisement among the youth pertaining to the more traditional forms of, say, calls for actions, public engagement, and media. And I'm not specifically referring only to the Singapore context, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, recently there was a UNDP report that looked at young people in Europe and Central Asia. And according to the report, young people find themselves inadequately represented in formal political structures and what they see as traditional avenues for advocacy, such as government-initiated conversations. So the online space then becomes a very accessible and viable alternative space for youth, right, who feel confident and empowered. Essentially, it is a terrain that they are familiar with and they feel competent enough to navigate. Then, and we talk about then maybe fringe groups taking more to social media to express and share their realities. So, again, in the recent study that was published by Pew Research Center on social media activism among Americans, they found that Black and Hispanic social media users are more likely than white users to have looked up information about protests and rallies, and they were also more likely than white users to post pictures to show support for a cause. So I think it is these greater representation, right? This maybe greater access to groups who may not feel that they are equally engaged in traditional settings.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you. Like you might not have a voice in mainstream media, and then rather than bottle it up, you go online and then you find an outlet, and also you find like-minded people, you find solidarity, you find friends. Is that what was your experience? What do you think you have gained so far from starting your account until now?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that that's so much of my experience, but I can imagine where, let's say you give, you essentially, social media allows you to present an unaltered version of your point of view, right? Because when it goes through editors, maybe you lose your voice somewhere. And like Carol, you say, these could be places of misrepresentation, or the fact that, some youth of a certain demographic is just not represented on a lot of stages that are presented to the masses. And social media becomes a place where you are very assured that no one is going to change the narrative of what you already put out. We grew up with social media. We know how to more or less control what goes out.
You are social media native in a way.
I guess in a sense, even though whether we use it responsibly or irresponsibly is another thing, but it becomes a sacred space for your lived reality, especially if you want to publicize it, to be one that is untouched by a lot of other factors.
Censorship?
I guess with certain laws, I'm not sure whether censorship plays into a role, because it's definitely a factor when it comes to presenting certain voices. But at the same time, I know a lot of activists, Singapore and abroad, who started their social media pages because they weren't seeing themselves represented on panels, on podcasts, on things like that. Because, if you're of a majority race, sometimes we have blind spots. People have blind spots. And I know there are groups where, let's say at COP26, women are not being represented at these things. So they start their entire side events and own podcasts to represent women that were not included in these conversations. So I think what I learned from social media is the fact that actually everyone has a voice. You just have to choose the right platforms in which you feel most comfortable expressing it. That can be physical, artistic medium, social media, and things like that. And I think once we allow that to happen, you they always talk about we want a vibrant civil society, right? And that gives rise to not just a lot of ideas, but you hold errant people accountable, organizations accountable, and ultimately you advance a goal. Everyone has their own agendas, but I would think that, for a lot of us fighting for social change, this kind of discourse allows me to refine a lot of my thinking. As much as I fight for the end of fossil fuels, I also need to recognize what are the voices of people working in fossil fuels. I wouldn't be able to reach that if it wasn't for me very publicly putting it out there and being open to certain disagreements and things like that. So public expression, or that kind of expression, is important for our society to grow and progress.
Just going back to a previous point, I just wanted to ask, were you ever worried that your criticisms were too pointed, or you might think that maybe the government may be unhappy with what you are advocating?
I guess to some extent, you always worry about being too public about certain things, right? Because there are repercussions, whether it's government or not. Being too out there with your personal life could mean putting yourself at risk for various things, because now with social media, you can even go down to a location and it's very, very scary on things like that. So of course, there's always worries about putting yourself out there. And it comes with, again, responsible usage of media and how you protect yourself, especially in the digital age.
Carol, in conclusion?
No, I think this is really interesting. We really didn't, as we studied the space, since 1990s, and 1990s, the internet was Usenet.
Historical.
Yahoo discussion groups.
Archaeology.
And look at where we are now, right? So I think the trend clearly points to what I call an increasing microtization of activism. We see micro actors, okay, and micro actors doesn't mean small and insignificant. We see micro actions, from memes to organizing rallies. And we also see micro causes, right? Which when amplified and taken up in related policy domains, can have quite powerful impact. And I think one final note is really quite interesting, since, say, the last IPS Civil Society Conference, which was convened in 2013, right?
Wow.
Yes.
A lifetime ago, man.
Yes, it does. We do see a new generation of change makers or opinion leaders who increasingly, through the affordances of social media, are doing what we call the traditional civil society actors are doing, right? So they are, using different social media tools like online polls to canvass public opinion regarding a specific issue. And then they are very able, to consolidate the kind of sentiments and responses that they canvass and then subsequently convey them to policymakers when they are invited to sit in dialogue sessions. So I would say these 3 C's, right? Canvas, consolidate, and convey. So I think the future is extremely interesting. Our hope is on young people like you.
Qiyun, any last word?
Yeah, I always get very scared when I hear the hope is on young people because
Too much pressure.
And also, I mean, when they say the hope is on young people, to me, at least, social media activism, one thing that worries me is that it's overly represented by young people, right? That I lose the oral history of past civil society actors who have done works in so many different ways that I wonder, am I in an echo chamber by default by being on social media and things like that? So to me, the kind of intergenerational exchange, intergenerational organizing of civil society actors is actually far more interesting. Physical organizing is also a lot more, I would say, heartwarming, a lot more comforting than being on an online space that is already, it feels sanitized because there's just very little physical human interaction. So what I'm excited about in this new civil society, hopefully, is a hybrid of the digital and the physical, and how digital spaces can advance a lot of human interactions and human connections on what we can really look like as a Singapore civil society or an international civil society.
Yeah, and I think we also need to think about how do we bring those who are now either not online but are keeping quiet, right? Because past IPS surveys done during general election, I think the 2015 one, as well as a more recent 2021, as well as a recently published survey by the National Youth Council, do point out the fact that the majority of online users are quietly consuming information, quietly surveilling what other people think about specific issues, right? So people like you who are actively producing content really is the minority. So I think that we need to take heed of that and not overgeneralize certain sentiments, and also at the same time think about how do we get more people on board.
Cool. Okay. So I think we have a very, very rich conversation today, not just on online activism, but hopefully hybrid activism in the future. So I'd like to thank Carol and Qiyun for their time today. Thank you all for listening in. See you on the next episode of On Diversity. On Diversity is a podcast inspired by the Institute of Policy Studies Managing Diversity's research program. Please follow or subscribe to the On Diversity podcast to get notified when we have a new episode. You can visit our website ipscommons.sg for more info.